All right, everybody, welcome back to the Finance Year, another edition. This week, we'll talk about the infrastructure bill and jobs, what's going on in America, what's on the mind of the current president, what's happening in the Senate and the Congress, and all the how it impacts the American people, our global system, how we will trade off now with other superpowers like China. Again, if you're just tuning in, feel free to ask comments or questions, what your thoughts are. We're going to talk about the infrastructure bill, America's job plan that President Biden has proposed in the last week. This is not the only stimulus plan coming to market. Obviously, there were two that happened since his election. This is a $1.9 trillion plan, so it's really big money. Next, he'll probably do something else that will come up and maybe later in the spring. That'll be more of a social infrastructure plan. But without further ado, we're going to talk about what's happening in the infrastructure bill. What's on your mind? I'd love to hear about what you're seeing in the market. So feel free to ask some questions. Feel free to chime in. Again, I'm in the comments, so feel free to just tweet or do whatever you feel is necessary. So first up, Biden's bill, $1.9 trillion. Not a small amount by any means. Definitely important. It's been discussed many times in past presidential cycles. Every single president has done some sort of infrastructure investment. President Trump was expected to do a larger thing, but I think he would have done it in his second term if he was reelected. But either way, America's infrastructure is in a pretty bad shape. We really need to figure out how to invest back into, let's say, the roads, bridges, telecommunications, transportation. There are a lot of social welfare, social health care programs. There's a lot of housing. There are a lot of infrastructure assets that simply have been neglected for the past 30, 40 years. So I'll talk about a couple of plans that we've done in the past, how they worked, why they were successful, what's currently happening in the economy today, and then what's being proposed next for America. So in the last century, we had a couple of huge major infrastructure assets. These are not inflation-adjusted numbers, but I'll talk about a couple of them right now. First up was Ellis Island. It was built in 1900 for $1.5 million. Probably multiply that by like 10, 15. So it was probably like 20, $30 million plus. At current dollars. The Hoover Dam was created and completed in 1936 for about $49 million. DARPA, which is the Defense Act, was founded in 1958 for about $246 million, and they've continuously been investing on it year over year. It's a very critical piece. For people that don't know, the internet was invented out of DARPA. There was military communications. There was a strong need for this. And then the other one was the Apollo space program, which was proposed by President Kennedy at the time. This program was really at its peak from 1961 to 1969. It cost $24 billion for us to figure out how to get to space, beat Russia, get to the moon, do a lot of things. That program really died off in the late 80s, but it really did a lot to build communications, defense, military. It was very vital. It only cost $24 billion. Not inflation adjusted, but we're still talking about a couple $100 billion in today's dollars. That's a pretty big project. When you compare it to the $1.9 trillion plan that Biden is proposing, I'm going to break down a couple of line items. The space program alone had a huge impact on society going decades ahead. And that was a big chunk. We're talking about a couple $100 billion in inflation adjusted. And the last one I'll mention is a pretty important one by President Eisenhower. It took about 35 years from 1954 to 1991. Was the Interstate Highways Act. It was a gigantic investment in the country. It was very important. It really distinguished the United States. A lot of other countries followed us afterwards. So Europe already had something similar with their inter-country highways, but China and India really followed suit. They have fantastic highways now. They have great infrastructure. We'll talk about China and Japan's railway system, where we as the United States actually lag. But it's important to remember that this is something that happened in the last century. So in the last 100 years, we did Ellis Island, Hoover Dam, DARPA, the Apollo Space Program, the interstate highways. That's 5 major ones. I'll also mention that the Empire State Building at one point only took about 410 days from start to finish. So we were a pretty amazing country for the last 100 years. We did a really good job of investing in our people, creating construction jobs. It was a very good way to really get back, invest back in the American people. But something really happened that was a negative in the last 20, 30 years. A lot of that investment, a lot of that manpower got derailed and went elsewhere. So if you have thoughts about the infrastructure bill, feel free to ask a question. Let me know what you've already either seen historically or what your thoughts are on the current plan. So the intent is to really invest back in the country. COVID was a big wake-up call. We had about $6 billion worth of stimulus in 2020 to bring back the economy. We locked down for a very long period of time. Some states and cities are still locked down. So we have to really recover. We're going to have a huge tax deficit, which we'll talk about how they're funding this plan. But it's important to realize that we haven't done much in the country to really reinvest in the country. The stimulus is a great way to bridge the gap and focus on the financing that's missing, to get our bridges, tunnels, everything back to the area where it needs to be. So to start up, President Biden's plan is modernizing about 20,000 highways, plus 10,000 of the worst small bridges in America. It's important to realize that, right now, travel and airports, they're still they're minimum, especially international travel. They're just reopening this to do international travel. But it's important to realize that America's airports are not in the top 25 in the world. We may have been at one point in time, but no, it's no longer the case. I think there are more in Europe, and especially in China. I think China has several of the top 25 airports. There are a couple other countries, maybe even Singapore and other countries that may also be in the top 25. That's a big project. It's not that different from investing in the Apollo space program or air flight, military or anything. Airports are a pretty critical piece of infrastructure in this country. If people want to get in and around, people are really, when they're immigrating into the country now, it's like investing in Ellis Island, which I mentioned before, which is a $1.5 million plan in 1900s. Investing in the airports is how people enter and leave the country. So, when people are coming into the country, I think it's very important to actually provide them, this grand opening, have great access, the best technology, the infrastructure to get around, to show them that these are the Golden Gates of America, which is something that Jersey City used to be named of after Ellis Island. So these are big problems. So the first up thing that I'll mention after the highways that were invested or proposed in this plan, Biden is really focused on bringing back manufacturing. One of the biggest problems last year was a lot of critical supplies such as food, medical equipment, PPE, and a lot of other things weren't accessible. Either they were delayed by shipping or they simply were there's a significant shortage. So the American Jobs Plan, as it's called, is looking for ways to invest back into these areas. But to take a step back, I think so. If you go on this plan, you could look at the link at the techfinancier.com. I have a couple links showing how the plan is broken down. $1.9 trillion. It's really broken down into 3 different buckets. But transportation, housing and infrastructure, that includes waters, utilities, electricity, and then some social welfare programs. But I think that the biggest piece is really transportation, because that's an area that the federal government needs to invest in. The other programs, state and local cities and municipalities can invest in further and better, depending on where they are in the country, because not everyone has the same needs. But federal transportation programs are pretty significant. So let's break down this part of the budget. It's about $621 billion for transportation. 28% or about $174 billion of it will be invested in electric vehicles. That's a big investment. It's critical. The Obama administration did this to really revitalize a lot of the electric assets that we were investing in or wanted tax credits for in R&D. Tesla really took advantage of this, came to market. Now we have a dozen electric cars coming to market. A lot more infrastructure needs to be invested into batteries. So storage of energy is a pretty critical asset. If you don't know this, that the rare metals like nickel and carbonite that are needed for battery production are actually, a lot of them are based and mined in China and other parts of Asia. So the United States can never be energy independent like we were with oil, and pretty much are with sustainable energy, because we don't have the capacity to produce battery storage like we could with oil just yet. But there are ways, people are investing in it. So I think that's important to note, and it's something that we need to designate more dollars to, which I'll mention in a little bit. Another piece of the infrastructure, the transportation piece of the infrastructure plan, is $280 billion is designated for fixing roads, bridges, and railway systems. I mentioned the 20 and 10,000. But besides the recent upgrades to the New York Penn Station, there hasn't been much investment in the railway systems and transit lines in America for a pretty long time. The most recent project I could find was the American Railroad project, which was built 21 years ago for Amtrak's Acela. This train only runs about 70 miles per hour as an average, compared to China's high-speed railway, which is about triple that. So there's a lot of things that we're really lacking in that area. I don't even want to get started with America's shipping ports, which could use a lot more investment compared to China and other parts of Southeast Asia. But that's only about $600 billion that I've talked about. It's about a third of the current plan. We have another $1.3 trillion that's devoted to homes, schools, elderly care, and a lot of other areas. So first up, it's not a surprise that this is a big dollar amount. $600 billion was just for transportation, and $1.9 trillion is not a small penny. Right now, so I mentioned that $6 trillion was last year was funded towards COVID stimulus and other credit and care packages. We're currently on track to do another $6 trillion for 2021. So it's a pretty big number. Obviously, the debt to GDP ratio is being blown out of the charts. So I think it's the first time now that we're surpassing the debt to GDP ratio. We haven't done that. Compared to other countries in the world that have done this, like China, the debt load will crush Americans to pay it back. And right now, we're like really taking advantage of the fact that low interest rates, no inflation. But if this thing starts picking up and it's really expensive to pay it back, it's going to crush America. It's going to be very difficult to fund this. And if we have another couple $1 trillion, which it seems will probably be on the rank of $4 to $5 trillion at the minimum after May, the current politicians may introduce more stimulus plans or find out ways to do additional funding to pay for all these packages. The first piece, which I polled last week on LinkedIn, is that President Biden has decided to, or he wants to propose to raise corporate tax rates from 21 to 28%. Everybody expects that interest tax rates will increase with all these new funding plans. I think income tax rates will also increase for earners above $400,000. So you'll see that it'll be very expensive. We won't be a competitive nation in that sense, but there's no way around it at this point if we want to invest so much money. My concern is that the money that's being invested is not being allocated in areas that will move the needle enough, because these type of plans don't happen just once. They have to be done well, so they last for a very long period of time, more than 50 years, and they continue to be leaders in the space, in technology, transportation. I haven't mentioned telecom yet, but we'll get to that. So this is big. So what would I do in this case? I would take the 1.9 trillion, or let's say 2 trillion, and I would divide it into two halves. One is climate change, and the other is transportation. So we're talking about $1 trillion each. Both of them have a very long-term impact. My primary concern with the current bill is that a lot of leakage will happen. A lot of the other dollars that are invested in these small little programs, $25 billion here, $100 billion there, the impact won't move the needle, and a lot of money will be given to subcontractors, a lot of people that just are just going to be doing the job and not going to be focused on the outcome because the government will be writing a lot of checks. So if we focus on two areas, climate change and transportation, it will be much better for the economy and the world. First up, we need to become sustainable, have sustainable energy. We have to have a better infrastructure to figure out how we can use less natural gas, non-renewable energy sources. And this is very doable. We've already proven it in some areas, which is important, which is why it's more important to say, all right, how can we invest in the windmills, the dams, like the Hoover Dam project I mentioned before? How can we invest in solar energy projects, battery storage, electric cars? $1 trillion in this area will produce hundreds of new companies, and in some cases really help us figure out how to solve the energy crisis in that case. And then transportation is pretty big alone, and this covers a variety of areas. I have no problem investing in bridges, tunnels, and other areas like roads, but the problem with those investments is they're not reoccurring. So climate change and energy crisis problems are reoccurring. You invested it, you create a job, it lasts for 10, 15, 20, 30 years, and there's a constant need to reinvest and make it more affordable. When you achieve scale, that productivity factor makes it cheaper to deliver energy across the world. So that's a very important investment in my eyes. It should be number one. Transportation is good. It's important. I would focus more on the railway systems. There are so many opportunities here for underground tunnels, above ground freight, and consumer railway. Our railway system is very slow compared to other countries. Bridges and tunnels are important. A couple $100 billion will go far to improve the worst ones in the country. But once they're done, then there's no real way to replenish that except from tolls. So the jobs created will be temporary in this sense. And it's not the best in my eyes, but I think it's very important to still do. And it's very important to say that this will create jobs, construction jobs, which are very important. They create blue and white collar jobs in this case. So I think that's important. The reason I mentioned these two areas is, one, climate change and transportation, they've proven themselves. So it's pretty smart to just go ahead and reinvest in these areas. The third one I might put in there, I'd love to see it probably more than the other two, but I think we've already invested a lot in this, and private companies can invest more and do more in this space, is telecom. So to create higher speed internet, better bandwidth, lower latency, just to provide better technologies would be a great place to just reinvest, because we've seen the return on investment when we've done these in the last 30, 40 years, specifically with wireless internet. Again, if you have any questions about the infrastructure plan or what I've already mentioned or discussed, feel free to just reach out, a comment. I'm still watching all the comments and Twitter feed, so if you have any questions, just drop it in. Let's just take a step back about what's happening with the current plan, why I propose climate change and transportation as the primary areas to reinvest. The best analogy, or the area where we're already seeing this happen, is through Elon Musk. He's done this in a variety of areas. He's proven it with his own capital base. He's raised private capital to do these with Tesla, SpaceX, the Boring Company, and a few of his other ventures. And he's made a greater impact in climate change specifically and energy by himself, and he's shown that he can make an impact. He's done more in this space than any businessman or even politician probably combined. So if one man could do this, and we supported him through venture capital and other forms of capital, if we could figure out how to fund 10, 20, 30 younger, maybe smaller guys like himself to do specific niches in this space, we'll solve the energy crisis within the next 50 years. And I think it'll be magnificent. And he's doing this for transportation as well. He's using transportation as his vehicle, no pun intended, say, I'm going to solve the energy crisis through this gate. And it's also important to note that it just launched the Starlink. So SpaceX, which is his space program, is shooting out all these satellites in the world so they could provide higher speed internet in rural areas across America and rural parts of the world that don't have access to high speed internet. So it's important to say, like, this guy's already doing it. How could we accelerate a lot of those visions? How can we increase higher paying jobs, increase more automation so that people can work on better areas of the world? They can work on better jobs. They have more free time, work on more creative stuff. It'll solve a lot of the other problems that the infrastructure plan wants to do. So in my eyes, it doesn't make sense to just, take the 1.3 billion that's kind of being wasted and is going to be leaked and thrown away in some cases. I think it's more sensible to say these are the two areas we'll focus on, trillion each. We're going to solve it, and we're going to be leaders. So we can be leaders in these space in the next 20 years and solve the problems in the next 50 years. So I think that's pretty important. It is. He did announce this infrastructure proposal last week. It's coming at a pretty good time. So, last week, the jobs report came out on Friday. It was a very strong number at 916,000. The unemployment rate has fallen to 6%. So it's a good timing because we had to get unemployment rate back down to the 3-4% it was pre-COVID. And if we could do that, I think we could do that with the infrastructure plan. It's pretty exciting. It's a good place to raise the capital and reinvest in the country. My question is, where is it being reinvested, and will it make the impact that is necessary to really, really make America great again, keep us as leaders in a lot of the important areas when we're looking at China, Russia, European nations, who's really competing with us head on. These are the areas we need to focus on where we think we'll continuously be competitive. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the infrastructure plan. Again, if you feel like you have any questions, always comment and reach out. There's a lot more that's going to be discussed. Not everything is signed, sealed, and delivered yet, so there's a lot more on the table. After this plan, President Biden is expected to have even another stimulus plan, which I expect will be in that $1 trillion range as well. So it'll be, it's pretty scary to see how much debt is being accumulated in a very short period of time. But it's important to realize where the money is being invested, which is more important to me because there's a lot of areas that we can be investing that we're not. And if we're not investing enough, that money will be lost. Like the last stimulus plan, a lot of the money wasn't COVID related. It was related to a lot of other packages that weren't approved in the last COVID bill. So it's important to keep your eyes open. Again, this is the Finance Year, the weekly show. If you had any questions, all this is available on the techfinanceyear.com. You can always contact me or follow me on any of the socials on my left. You can always reach out on LinkedIn, Quora, and Twitter. This is all be available on YouTube, so feel free to like and subscribe. Again, feel free to reach out. We'll be uploading a lot more content, looking for more ideas. A lot of more questions are coming in offline, so I'll be recording them and showing those clips whenever they're available. Until next time, I'll see everybody. Take care.